The morning they loaded Vera Caslin's hogs onto my grandmother's property, it was a Tuesday in late October of 1987, and the fog lay so low across the creek bottoms that you couldn't see the fence posts from the road. I remember standing at the end of the lane with my hands in my jacket pockets, watching that old livestock trailer come up through the gray, its wooden slats rattling, mud still caked on the wheel wells from wherever those animals had come from before. I was 19 years old, my grandmother was 63, and the two of us were the only people in Callaway County who thought what she was doing made any sense at all. She had paid $1 an acre for 41 acres of ground that the county land office had been trying to move for 11 years. $41 plus the filing fees, which came to another $15. $55 total for ground that every sensible person in 3 townships had looked at and walked away from. The Thistle Flats, they called it, and not as a compliment. It was low ground, wet ground, ground that grew buttonbush and sedge grass and a particular variety of tall thistle that came up so thick in July you could lose a calf in it. The drainage tile, if there had ever been any, had failed or silted or never been sufficient to begin with. In a wet spring, the east third of those 41 acres would pond up to your knee. In a dry summer, it would crust over hard and crack, and the cracks would run 4 and 5 inches deep, which told you something about the clay content if you were paying attention, which most people were not. The county assessor had it valued at $40 an acre, and even that felt generous to the men at the feed store. By the time my grandmother signed the papers, the standing joke at Heller's Diner on Route 9 was that the land office had finally found someone to take the Thistle Flats, and that someone had a rooster weather vane and grew zinnias and probably didn't know any better. By noon the diner had a version of the story, and the version had grown. The figure they quoted was wrong. The pity in it was not. My grandmother's name was Opaline Marsh, and she had been farming 60 acres of decent ground on the other side of the creek since my grandfather died in 1971. She was not sentimental about acreage, she was not romantic about it. She kept a ledger the way a watchmaker keeps time, and she did not buy things she didn't understand. I want to be honest about that, because it matters to what comes after. She was not the kind of woman who acted on a feeling and called it wisdom. She acted on information, and the information she was acting on when she bought the Thistle Flats was not visible to anyone who hadn't been inside her barn in the right year, looking at the right shelf. The hogs were her instrument. That is the only word I have for what she intended them to be. She brought in 14 sows and 2 boars that October morning, a line of mixed heritage animals, deep-sided and heavy-shouldered, the kind that root rather than graze, the kind that will work a piece of ground the way a slow rain works a hillside, with patience and without mercy. Her neighbor to the east, a man named Carroll Pruitt, who drove a truck that was always cleaner than the season had any right to allow, watched those animals come off the trailer from his side of the fence line and did not say anything for a long time. Then he said, "What are you doing with 16 hogs on 41 acres of standing water, Opaline?" She told him she was farming. He nodded once, the way a man nods when he is being polite instead of honest, and he drove back toward his machine shed. I watched him go. I had the feeling, even at 19, that this conversation was not finished, that it would finish on different terms, in a different season. I did not know how many seasons it would take. The hogs went to work on the Thistle Flats the way hogs go to work on everything, which is to say, they went to work on it from the bottom up, and without asking anyone's opinion about the plan. By the second week of November, the east end of the property, the wet end, the ponding end, looked like something had detonated just below the surface. The root mass of 2.5 decades of unchecked vegetation had been turned and broken and nosed up into windrows of dark material that steamed faintly in the cold morning air. I would go out there before school sometimes, before I remembered I was 19 and didn't have school anymore, and I would walk along the edge of what those animals had worked and try to understand what my grandmother was looking at when she looked at it. The soil underneath was black. Not brown, not gray-brown, not the pale, silty color you get when you turn wet clay. Black. The kind of black that means something if you come from farming people. The kind of black that gets passed down as a word before it gets passed down as an explanation. My grandmother's father had farmed river-bottom ground in a county 2 hours south of here. He had died in 1959 when my grandmother was 35, and he had left her, along with a modest collection of hand tools and one good team harness that was already too old to use, a composition notebook. Marbled cover, black and white, the kind you buy at a 5 and dime for a quarter. His handwriting was small and careful and slanted a little to the right. The handwriting of a man who had been taught penmanship at a time when penmanship was considered a form of character. She kept that notebook in a cedar chest in the back bedroom, under a folded wool blanket and a bundle of letters tied with kitchen twine. I had seen it once when I was perhaps 12, and she had let me hold it, but not open it. "That is not yours yet," she said, "not yet. I want to be honest about the moment I am working toward here, because it did not happen quickly, and the not happening quickly is part of the point." She did not go to the cedar chest the night she bought the Thistle flats. She did not go to it the week the Hogs arrived. She let the animals work, and she watched, and she kept her own notes in her own ledger, and she did not speak to me about the notebook at all through that first winter. I understood eventually that she was waiting for the ground to confirm something before she went back to the page that said it. That was her method. The notebook was not a map. It was a key. And you don't reach for a key until you are standing at a lock. The winter of 1987 into 1988 was not brutal, but it was long, and the Thistle Flats froze in January, the way low ground freezes, hard on the surface and softer underneath, so that when you walked across it in February, you could feel it give slightly under your boots, a kind of slow, cold exhalation from the soil. The Hogs had been moved to a winter pen by then, 16 animals eating their way through a winter's worth of feed, while the ground they had worked rested under frost. I drove out to the property 2 or 3 times a week through those months, not for any technical reason, just because my grandmother asked me to. "Look at the east end," she would say. "Tell me what you see." I would go and look and come back and tell her what I saw, which for most of January and February was nothing except frozen, dark earth and the stubble of rooted vegetation, and, in the lowest corner of the east third, a faint circular depression, perhaps 12 feet across, that seemed to hold a different quality of ice than the ground around it. Clearer ice, thicker somehow. I mentioned it to her once. She put down her coffee cup and looked at the window for a moment. Then she said, "Go again Thursday." So I went again Thursday. The ice in that depression was the same. Clearer, thicker, and slightly domed in the center, as if something underneath it was pressing up against the underside of the frost. I told her that on a Thursday evening in the first week of February 1988, and she stood up from the kitchen table and went to the back bedroom, and I heard the cedar chest open, and then I heard it close, and she came back with the composition notebook and set it on the table between us without opening it. She put her hand flat on the cover, and she looked at me with an expression I can only describe as the face of a person who has been waiting a long time for permission to be right. Then she opened it. Her father's name was Eldon Caslin, and he had kept the notebook for approximately 20 years, from some time in the late 1930s through the mid-1950s, recording observations about soil, water, weather, and field behavior in a terse, technical shorthand that took some patience to read if you hadn't grown up around that kind of language. Drainage tile depths, noted in inches. Organic matter estimates, noted as rough fractions. The behavior of standing water after a hard rain, the direction of subsurface flow as best he could, determine it from where things pooled and where they didn't. It was the notebook of a man who watched the ground the way a doctor watches a patient, not for drama, but for information, and who wrote down what he saw in case someone after him needed to know it. Partway through, the entries shifted from his home ground to notes about other parcels he had looked at over the years. There were 6 or 8 of these described by section number and rough compass bearing from landmarks that no longer existed. The Thistle Flats entry was 4 pages from the back. She had circled it in pencil sometime, I thought, in the not-so-distant past. The entry was brief. It read, in its entirety, low corner by the creek bend holds different after rain. Clay bottom, but something else below. Probed to 4 feet. Change in resistance at 38 inches. Not tile, not stone. Feels like fitted work. Army Survey 1882 showed a well or cistern at this section. Never dug. It was underlined twice. The words never dug were underlined twice, and beside them, in a margin, in ink that was darker than the rest, was a single word with a question mark after it. The word was still. I want to tell you what I felt reading that, but I am not sure ordinary language is up to the task. It was not excitement exactly. It was something quieter and heavier than excitement. It was the feeling of a door opening that has been shut for a long time, not dramatically, not with a bang, but with the slow, certain movement of something that was always going to open when the right hand found it. My grandmother watched me read it. She did not say anything while I read it. When I looked up, she said, "That depression you've been looking at is 12 feet across, you told me." I said yes. She said, "Your great-grandfather probed to 38 inches and felt fitted work." I said yes. She said, "The Army Survey is in the county record office, has been since 1882, and nobody thought to pull it because nobody thought there was anything under that corner worth pulling a record for." Then she closed the notebook and set it beside her coffee cup and said, "We'll need to be careful about how we go at it, because if there's a structure down there, we don't want to open it wrong." The county record office in those years was a room in the basement of the courthouse that smelled of old paper and radiator heat, tended by a man named Gerald Foss, who had been down there so long he had the complexion of someone who worked by fluorescent light and never quite got enough of it. I went on a Wednesday morning in March of 1988 with the section number from the notebook, and Gerald Foss found the Army Survey in under an hour, which surprised me, and he laid it flat on a reading table under a gooseneck lamp and pointed to a notation in the lower quadrant of the survey map without me having to tell him what I was looking for. The notation read, "Subsurface cistern, brick-lined, approximately 9 feet depth, Army construction circa 1863, location marked by iron cap, cap condition, unknown at survey date." Gerald Foss looked at me over the top of that notation for a moment without speaking. Then he said, "Well," just that. Well. He made a copy of the relevant section on the office's copier, which was enormous and slow, and produced a copy that was slightly crooked, and he handed it to me without charging me for it, which was not standard practice, and I took it back to my grandmother's kitchen table, and we laid it next to the open notebook and looked at the 2 documents together, the way you look at 2 halves of a thing that were always meant to be the same whole. We did not open the ground that week. We did not open it the week after. My grandmother was not a person who moved faster than the situation required, and the situation required, in her view, some additional information before anyone put a shovel or a probe into that corner. She wanted to know about the water. That was her word for it, the water. She said, "If there's been a capped cistern sitting at 38 inches of depth for 125 years, and water is still present, that tells me something about the aquifer behavior under this ground, and I want to know that before I know anything else." That sentence has stayed with me for 37 years, because it is the sentence of a person who is not asking whether the thing is there. She already knew the thing was there. She was asking what the thing meant. There is a difference, and most people who deal with land for any length of time eventually learn to feel it, the difference between finding and understanding. She was already past finding. She was working on understanding. She called a man named Denton Farr, who was a drainage engineer out of a firm 2 counties east that mostly did agricultural tile work and had done a project for her on her own 60 acres in 1979. He came out on a raw morning in the second week of April, mud season still fully underway, driving a truck that was appropriately dirty for the conditions and carrying a set of probes and a small hand-operated device for measuring subsurface pressure differentials that I had never seen before and have not seen since. He was a quiet man, Denton Farr. 60 or so at that point, I would guess, though it is hard to say, because some men who work outdoors all their lives arrive at a kind of ageless, weathered quality that makes 30 years of their lifespan look roughly the same. He walked the east end of the Thistle Flats for about 40 minutes without saying anything that required an answer, and then he walked to the low corner, to the circular depression where the ice had been different all winter, and he stood at the edge of it for a while and looked at it, and then he got down on one knee and pressed his palm flat against the soil, the way my grandmother had pressed her palm flat against the notebook cover, and I thought, watching him, that there are gestures that recur across a life because they are the right gesture for a particular kind of attention. He probed the perimeter of the depression at 6 points, pulling notes on depth and resistance, and when he got to the 4th point, northeast of center, his probe hit resistance at 31 inches, and he stopped and pulled the probe and looked at it and set it down, and was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "There's something down here that isn't native geology." I told him I knew that. He said, "How deep do you want to go?" I told him what the Army survey said. He was quiet again. Then he said, "Brick-lined means it may have held its integrity." Then he stood up and looked out over the Thistle Flats toward the creek, which was running high and brown with the spring melt, and he said, "The water table here is sitting at about 22 inches right now because of the melt, but the pressure differential I'm reading in the center of this depression is running in the wrong direction for a simple water table effect. Something is coming up, not just sitting. You've got a live source somewhere below this. I do not know how deep, but it is not a simple seep." Then he picked up his probes and his pressure device, and he walked back toward his truck, and I walked with him, and he said one more thing before he got in. He said, "Substantial." He said it the way a man says a word that is meant to carry more weight than its 2 syllables suggest, and then he drove away, and I stood in the mud at the edge of the property and let the words settle on me like the first warm morning of a season you weren't sure was coming. We opened the ground on the first dry week of May, 1988. My grandmother hired a man with a small track hoe to take off the top 30 inches of material across a 12-foot circle centered on the depression. And then we went to hand tools, she and I, working carefully because the Army survey said brick-lined, and you do not take a machine to brick-lined work that has been down since 1863, if you can avoid it. The track hoe came off at 30 inches, and we shoveled for another 6. And at 36 inches, the shovel blade rang on something that was not soil and not stone, and we cleared the material away by hand, and there it was. An iron cap 9 inches across, set in a course of brick, laid in a pattern I had never seen. A herringbone pattern, the bricks intact, the mortar between them gone gray and friable, but present, still present, after 125 years under the Thistle Flats. The iron cap had a square lug on top, the kind made for a specific key wrench, and the lug was corroded but not seized. We did not open it that day. We photographed it, documented the depth, measured the brick course, and covered the excavation with a sheet of plywood weighted with 2 concrete blocks, and went back to the house. My grandmother sat down at the kitchen table and opened her own ledger to a fresh page and wrote the date and the depth and the brick pattern and the cap dimensions in her small, precise hand. And then she looked at what she had written for a while, and then she looked up at me and said, "Your great-grandfather probed to 38 inches and felt fitted work, and wrote never dug, and put a question mark beside the word still." I said yes. She said, "I think he would have been pleased that we went carefully." I said I thought so, too. She said, "We'll open it Thursday." We opened it on a Thursday morning with Denton Farr present, and a man from the county water office who came partly out of professional curiosity, and partly because my grandmother had described the brick course and the cap and the Army notation to him on the telephone, and he had not been able to talk himself out of driving over. His name was Arnett Colby, and he was the kind of state-employed expert who carries a clipboard and wears clean boots and speaks in the careful, hedged language of a man who has been wrong in public before and has learned from the experience. He said, before we opened the cap, that brick-lined cisterns of this period in this region were typically dry by the early 20th century due to the settling of the surrounding soil table, and that he would not want expectations to run ahead of the evidence. My grandmother thanked him for his perspective. Then we opened it. Denton Farr fitted the wrench to the lug and broke it loose on the third effort, and the cap came off with a sound that I can only describe as the sound of a long breath being released, a low, slow exhalation from the ground, and then we all leaned over the opening and looked down, and there was water. Still water, dark and cold and deep, reflecting a circle of May sky back up at us from somewhere below 5 feet of brick-lined shaft. Arnett Colby straightened up from the edge and looked at his clipboard and did not write anything on it for a moment. Then he said, "Exceptional." He said it quietly, as if it were a private opinion he had not quite meant to say aloud. And then he did write something on his clipboard, and he took 3 photographs with a small camera he had in his shirt pocket, and he said he would need to take a water sample and have it tested before he could say anything further. And I appreciated that about him, the honesty of it, the refusal to make the evidence carry more than it had earned yet. He took the sample in a glass jar with a screw lid, labeled it, put it in his truck, and drove back toward the county seat. And we stood there at the edge of the opened ground and looked down at the water that had been sitting there, still and dark and present, since before anyone living could remember. The water test came back 2 weeks later. The sample was clean. Not clean as in passable, not clean as in meets minimum standard, but clean in the way that Arnett Colby described it in his written report as exhibiting mineral clarity consistent with deep confined aquifer source, with contamination indices below detectable threshold on all 22 tested parameters. He came back out in person to deliver that, which he did not have to do, and which I took as its own form of restrained acknowledgement. He said in that same careful voice that in his 18 years with the county office he had not encountered a pre-20th century constructed cistern still in connection with a live confined source at this depth in this soil type, and that the brick course condition was, in his professional assessment, remarkable. That was the word he used, remarkable. He shook my grandmother's hand, and he drove away, and I noticed that his boots were muddy, which they had not been the first time he came. The practical question was what the water meant for the Thistle Flats, and the answer to that question took the rest of the summer of 1988 to work out. Denton Farr came back twice more, with additional equipment, and determined that the cistern was in connection with a confined aquifer layer sitting at approximately 14 feet of depth below the brick course, pressurized naturally by the topographic gradient from higher ground to the northwest. He said the static water level in the shaft, once the cap was removed and the shaft allowed to breathe, stabilized at about 4 feet below grade and held there through the dry weeks of July and August without dropping. He said, in the flat declarative tone of a man making a technical observation rather than an argument, that this was an exceptional natural pressure head for this part of the county, and that whoever had sited that cistern in 1863 had known exactly what they were doing. He said it as if he were surprised. I told him that the Army survey from 1882 suggested the siting was deliberate, that it was construction rather than accident. He nodded. He said, "Yes, that fits." I appreciated that too, the way a man of that caliber absorbs a fact and places it correctly without resistance. My grandmother began drawing water from the cistern to supply the hog pens in July of 1988. She ran a simple hand pump fitted to the original shaft opening, a cast iron pump she bought second-hand from a farm sale in August for $14, and the animals drank from it through that summer, and through the fall, and through the following winter. and the water level in the shaft never dropped below 4 feet from grade. The hogs by that point were ranging the Thistle flats through the dry months, and what they had done to the ground in nearly 2 years of working it was something you had to see to believe. The thistle was gone. Not reduced, gone. The buttonbush was gone. The sedge grass along the wet margins of the east third had thinned to almost nothing. The soil surface across the 41 acres had a broken, dark, open texture that bore almost no resemblance to the crusted, cracked, waterlogged ground my grandmother had paid $55 for in 1987. I drove out there on a Saturday morning in September of 1989, 2 years almost to the day from the morning the trailer had rattled up through the fog, and I walked the whole property, all 41 acres, and I carried my grandmother's ledger because she had asked me to take some notes. And when I got to the low corner and stood over the covered cistern shaft, I opened the ledger to the page where she had copied her father's notebook entry in her own hand. The entry about the low corner and the probing and the change in resistance and the Army survey and the word still with its question mark. And I stood there with the September light coming in low and gold across the Thistle flats, and I thought about Eldon Caslin, a man I had never met, who had pressed a probe into this ground in some year in the late 1940s or early 1950s, and felt something at 38 inches that he couldn't explain, and wrote it down, and underlined it twice, and left it in a notebook under a wool blanket in a cedar chest for whoever came after. He never dug. He ran out of time, or season, or circumstance, and he never dug. But he left the word still with a question mark beside it, and the question mark was the gift. The question mark was him saying, "I don't know yet, but someone should find out." Carol Pruitt drove by the east fence line on a morning in October of 1989. I was patching a post that had heaved in the spring thaw, and his truck came slow along the gravel road and stopped at the fence, and his window came down. He looked out over the Thistle flats for a while, at the turned and worked and opened ground, at the dark soil and the absence of thistle and sedge, at the hogs moving in the middle distance with the slow, satisfied authority of animals who have done the work they were bred to do. He was quiet for a long time. I waited. Then he said, "That's not as wet as it was." I said, "No." He said, "You pull that tile?" I said there wasn't any tile. He thought about that. Then he said, "Huh." He rolled his window up and drove toward his place. I went back to the fence post. That was the whole of it. That was the vindication, offered in 4 words across a fence line on a muddy October morning, delivered by a man in a clean truck to a man with his hands full of staple and wire. It was enough. It was more than enough. The Thistle Flats produced its first real income in 1990. My grandmother sold the 41 acres of worked, open, cistern-watered ground to a market gardener from the next county over for $410 an acre, which was the assessed value of comparable worked ground in that township at that time. $16,810 against an original investment of $55 and 3 years of hog feed and Denton Farr's time, and a second-hand cast-iron pump. The market gardener used the cistern water for his first 2 seasons, and then sank a proper well into the same aquifer 40 feet north of the original shaft and put in an electric pump and irrigated off it for the next decade. The last I heard, the ground is still in vegetables. The cistern is still capped. I imagine it is still full, dark, and cold and patient at 4 feet from grade, holding the same water it held in 1863, in 1950, in 1988, the same water my great-grandfather felt the presence of at 38 inches without ever opening the ground to see it. The field doesn't care who believes in it. That is something my grandmother said the spring we opened the shaft, standing at the edge of the excavation with her ledger under her arm and the May sky in the water below us. The field doesn't care who believes in it. It just keeps being what it is until someone pays enough attention to find out. I have thought about Eldon Caslin's notebook many times in the 36 years since my grandmother opened it on that February evening and laid it on the kitchen table between us. I have thought about the 20 or 30 years he carried the knowledge of that corner, the low corner with the different ice and the fitted work at depth, without the resources or the occasion to open it. I have thought about the fact that he wrote it down anyway, in small, careful penmanship in a composition notebook that cost him a quarter, because he understood that writing a thing down is an act of faith in whoever comes after. The difference between a problem and a lesson is only whether you were paying attention, and the difference between a lesson and a gift is only whether you wrote it down. He wrote it down. My grandmother read it. I went out on Thursday mornings and looked at the ice. I am 67 years old this November. I still have the composition notebook. It lives in my grandmother's cedar chest, which came to me when she died in 2003, along with her ledger and the copy Gerald Foss made of the Army Survey, crooked at the edge where the copier had been slow. I take the notebook out sometimes and read the Thistle Flats entry, all of it, from the first line about the low corner holding different after rain to the last line with its 2 underlines and its question mark. The question has been answered, but I leave the question mark in place because it seems wrong to remove it. It was not put there in ignorance. It was put there in patience. There is a difference, and it is everything. If you've got a piece of ground someone told you wasn't worth the filing fee, or an old notebook from a grandfather who watched things more carefully than he let on, or a corner of a field that behaves differently than the rest, and you've never understood why, I'd like to hear about it in the comments. Leave it there for someone else to read, the way Eldon Caslin left his question mark for whoever came next. Subscribe if this meant something to you. We move slow on this channel, but we get there.